I dreamed about it at first. It didn't seem quite so crazy then. After all, dreams are always a bit weird, especially mine. The only thing that set these dreams apart was how vivid they were. Each time I was aboard a ship, sometimes it was large and sometimes it seemed like I was on a tiny raft. But every time the waves were rolling wildly, tossing the ship to and fro as torrents of rain battered down around me. The wind raged, making the drops strike my exposed face like whiplashes. It's how the dream starts every time, right smack in the middle of this awful storm. And then, just as I feel certain that the ship is going to capsize, plunging me into the terrible depths of the water below, it appears out of the fog. A house. Now, sometimes small details change, like the color of the shutters or the number of windows, but it's always pretty much the same. A double-story family home, perched upon a section of rock that seems entirely too small to support such a structure. The dreams never got much further than that, though. The longest of them ended with my ship crashing into the rocky surface, then almost immediately faded to black. I'd wake up with a gasp every time, the rapidly cooling sweat on my skin too closely resembling the sheets of rain my imagination had just thrust upon me. Adrenaline would make its final rounds through my system, leaving me awake for at least another 15 minutes before I could drift off once more. Still, everyone has bad or upsetting dreams. Ultimately, I never thought much of it. I hadn't ever had a reoccurring dream before, but I had plenty of friends and family members who had, and there never seemed to be much to it. Sometimes, there was an underlying stressor that was freaking them out. Sometimes there were no reason whatsoever. And so I just took it as fact of life and moved on. I hadn't had the dream in several months when my good friend, Tegan, invited me out on her latest toy, a deep-sea fishing boat. T was always coming across these new playthings ever since her father passed away and left her an inheritance the size of multiple third-world countries combined. That was in her words. She had made the choice to keep working despite her newfound fortune, which left her plenty of disposable income to throw around. "I call her the real deal," she declared proudly as we walked down the freshly stained dock that morning. Seeing Tegan clamber over the boat's side and onto the deck made me chuckle despite myself. She's a small woman, barely 5'4", with some generous flats, and with a very slight build. It made the real deal look, well, massive. "The thing makes you look like a toddler," I remarked, swinging my legs over the side to join her on the boat. "When did you learn to drive one of these things again?" T had shot me a quick glare before busying herself with readying the boat, making sure that the motor was lowered safely into the water, and that all the ropes and weights were untied and properly pulled back into the mid-sized ship. "My dad taught me when I was like 17, was her answer. I remember mentioning that was nearly 15 years ago, before the boat revved to life and lurched forward. "Whatever, jackass, it's not like we're going to go out very far anyways," she'd reply. I guess that's what you would call some tongue-in-cheek foreshadowing for how our day was about to go. When we started out, the sky was crystal clear and the sun was unrelenting. We had both peeled our layers down into our bathing suit. I was in my trunks, and her in an overly complicated-looking two-piece that she slapped me for criticizing, insisted I had no idea what true fashion was anyway. She wasn't exactly wrong. Fashionable or not, we loaded up on the sunscreen and continued toward deeper water at a questionable high speed, creating frothy wakes behind us as we cruised. We sailed for maybe 30 or 40 minutes before T declared herself satisfied, and we began to go around to either end of the boat to cast anchor. The boat's radar cheerfully pinged from the dashboard. showing us how deep the water below was, and was bouncing back off of the schools of fish that passed by frequently. Seemed to be a good spot. I congratulated her on getting us out pretty far with no hiccups or brushes with death, and together we started to unpack the fishing equipment. I was far from what you'd call an experienced fisherman, having only been once or twice as a teen and, well, never on the ocean. I was more into the whole hanging out and drinking beer aspect of fishing, which is why I left T to prepare our rods, while I started to rifle through the cooler we'd brought along for the ride. I was elbow deep in an icy slurry when I noticed it had suddenly grown much darker. It felt like a large cloud had passed over the sun, and a sharp breeze accompanied it. I heard Tegan mutter a confused litany of swears, and I turned around, my eyes widening as I saw the sky full of dark, foreboding clouds billowing in to surround us from all sides. In mere moments, all traces of the sun and the perfectly blue sky we'd set sail under were completely blanketed in thick, unrelenting gray. "We need to get the fuck out of here," T said, disbelief still written all over her face. The failing light was making it hard to see much, but I could tell there was an awful lot of fear in her expression, too. She dropped the fishing poles to the ground and scrambled back to the steering wheel. I felt completely helpless, as I knew nothing about operating boats or even basic navigation, especially not in bad weather, and it was quickly becoming apparent that we were in the middle of a nasty storm. The wind had picked up to some serious gale force levels, rocking the boat as if we were a tiny raft instead of a moderately sized deep water craft. And I could just make out T's cries of frustration and mounting panic over the howls of the wind, and they were promptly drowned out by the instantaneous buckets of rain that soon followed. Swearing and shivering, I made my way over to the wheel to see what was happening. "The damn thing's dead," she shouted, blinking hard against the water droplets hammering against her face. "What the hell do you mean it's dead?" I answered, gripping into the wheel and staring in desperation at the now lightless panels beside it. T made a fist and smashed it into the dashboard, then opened her mouth to respond. She didn't get a chance, as an enormous flash of light blinded us both, followed immediately by the loudest clap of thunder I've heard in my entire life. It left my ears ringing, and as we both staggered to regain our wits, the boat was tossed wildly to the side. Huge waves were throwing the real deal around like a play toy, and we were both falling back and forth as we struggled to stay afloat. We weren't doing a great job, and T was quickly overpowered by a particularly rough toss that sent the side of her head slamming against the top of the steering wheel. She slumped over into the driver's seat, her eyes rolling back into her head, and her body falling limp. Now I shouted until my throat was utterly raw, fighting my way against the powerful gusts of wind until I could wrap my arms tightly around Tegan and the seat. Her head lulled with each toss of the boat, but I could tell she was still breathing. I intertwined my fingers, locking my arms in place and holding us both as still as I could as the storm rampaged around us. It felt like hours that I crouched there, soaked and shivering, barely able to see my incapacitated friend through the thick sheets of rain. My arms and legs had begun to ache, but soon went completely numb from the cold and their rigid positioning. It's almost funny to say that, even then, I hadn't thought of my nightmares from months before. My thoughts were only about keeping T as safe as possible, and of the very real possibility of death for us both. A few particularly humongous waves smashed into us, rendering the boat almost entirely on its side. The cooler and fishing poles were long gone overboard, and my heart was in my throat, certain that we were about to be too. I closed my eyes, whispered some last-minute goodbyes under my breath, and waited to feel myself go flying through the air and crash into the vile waters. Yet instead, the boat returned to its level stance, rocking gently as it had before this all began. The loud roaring of the wind and rains died down, and the air pressure suddenly dropped so fast that my ears popped painfully. I cracked open my eyes, peering around curiously. It was still dark, not nearly as intense as before. The clouds above were a paler shade of gray, and the rain was still falling heavily, but not with the painful force it had been moments before. Shakily, I unwrapped my arms and began to stand upright. My muscles screamed in protest, and I stumbled to stay on my feet as my blood began to circulate once more. Tegan groaned in her seat, but remained unconscious. Cautiously, I stepped back into the more exposed deck of the boat, and I almost immediately fell backward in shock. There, no more than a dozen feet away from us, stood a house. It was on a slender precipice of craggy rock, but the waves lashing up against the structure gave the illusion that it was set directly on the water itself. Either option was equally as impossible out here, and all at once my dreams came back to me, and the overwhelming déjà vu made me feel lightheaded. The house was just as I recalled it, a modern Victorian home, double-story with a wrap-around porch. There was a small turret off to its side. Its pointy coned roof pierced the storm clouds. The siding was immaculately navy in color, seemingly unaffected by the rain and constant onslaught of a brace of salty waves. The dark gray shutters didn't even move in the wind, and the only sign that the house acknowledged its place in this environment was the raindrops covering its vinyl siding and plunking against its dark windows. I heard another groan behind me and turned to see Tegan returning from the depths she'd been unkindly slammed into. Her eyes fluttered open, and she glanced about wildly before wincing and grabbing the side of her head that had hit the wheel. She had a pretty good lump already forming. I rushed towards her, urging her to move slowly and trying to gauge just how out of sorts she was. "Oh, fuck. Are you seeing this?" she said, ignoring my questions and attempts to keep her seated. She rose to her feet quickly, wincing and stumbling as she pointed over my shoulder to the house. "The house, yeah," I replied, glancing back around at the impossible feature that the boat was slowly, gently floating closer to. "What the fuck?" She stepped shakily onto the deck, gripping tightly to one of my arms as she sorted out her balance. "Wait, house? What house?" Now it was my turn to be out of sorts. Turning fully around to face the house once more, I narrowed my eyes in concentration. It was completely unexplainable, yes, but it was clearly a house. Tegan was staring at the same spot with wide, uncomprehending eyes. The house right there," I pointed adamantly, wondering now which one of us had actually hit their head. "It's this big Victorian. It's right there, T. You're looking right at it right now." She shook her head slowly, pulling her hand away from my arm and crossing both of hers in front of her chest, shivering. I'd almost forgotten how freezing I still was, standing in the frigid rain in just my swimsuit. No, that's no house," she said somberly, eyes flitting briefly back to meet mine before focusing again. "I need to go." Without warning, she sprinted toward the front of the ship, which was now only a few feet away from the rock surface. I shouted out in protest, running after her and asking just what the hell she thought she was doing. I didn't move fast enough, and within seconds she had thrown herself from the boat and onto the rocks. The house towered above her, and she stared up at it as she pushed herself up from her skinned knees, though she claimed not to see it. She certainly saw something. I was reluctant to leave the boat, and as there was nothing to tie or dock it to, and I didn't see how else we were ever going to get back home without it. Still, as my best friend continued up toward the house's entrance, I knew I couldn't just let her out of my sight. Cursing, I took a running head start and jumped from the front of the boat out onto the rock face. The jagged pieces cut into my hands and forearms, and the sandals I'd worn, anticipating a day of leisure, almost led me to snapping my ankles as they slipped out from under my feet. I kicked them off frantically as I saw Teag slip into the house and out of my line of vision. Ignoring the pain coursing through my exposed feet and scraped skin, I raced across the short area of bare rock before reaching the house's porch steps and leaping over them to the front door, which Teag had left open behind her. Panic mounting inside of me. I slipped into the gloom of the house, and I felt a rush of air as the door slammed behind me. On instinct, I swung around, confirming that the door had shut on its own, and experimentally I jostled the doorknob, finding that it wouldn't budge at all. It was stubbornly locked. I wasn't entirely sure if I felt any more shock at that point, both because this felt so familiar, and because what ominous, impossible doom house doesn't lock you inside once you've entered? I spun back around, taking in my surroundings. I'd never made it into the house in my dreams, even though the sense of déjà vu was still so strong. There was a massive spiral staircase directly in front of me in this open-air foyer, rising far higher than any two-story home would be capable of. Rooms filled with dusty, ornate oak furniture stood to my left and right. The dim, gray lighting and sound of rain hitting the roof and windows made me feel uneasy. My throat still felt like mangled meat from earlier, but I managed to let out some croaky cries for Teag, though she'd only entered maybe 30 seconds before me. It was apparently long enough for her to have vanished entirely. I hesitated to choose a direction to head in, and ultimately decided to take the stairs to at least the next level up. The staircase was crafted from dark carved wood, and my bare feet made a distracting slapping sound with each step I took. I continued calling for Teag, hearing nothing but my own voice echoed back to me, and I became distinctly aware that despite taking more and more steps, I didn't seem to be getting any closer to the next floor landing. I was preparing to shout again when I heard a scuttling noise that brought me to a standstill. It reminded me of the sound a clawed animal makes when it's sliding and rushing quickly on a slick surface. But this felt far more precise than that. Someone or something was creeping very close to me, very fast. I swung around, trying to peer through what little light there was, all the while shouting for my lost friend. The scuttling sound grew louder and then more numerous, as if I was being surrounded by a multitude of whatever was approaching. My breathing grew ragged and my chest clenched as I first caught sight of what I was hearing. Thin, pointed legs began to slip out of the shadows. They were black and glistening like spider legs, only there were too many to count, and they were far, far larger. The appendages were all around me, clicking against the smooth wall surface, and as more and more appeared, I began to hear voices, and it was a horrible, twisted attempt at my own voice that I heard, calling out to Teag over and over. The cadence and pitch were all wrong, like if you'd put my voice through the auditory equivalent of a funhouse mirror. I'd never felt such a primal level of fear like that in all of my life, and I was rendered completely frozen as the creatures continued to crawl into the light. My horror increased as I saw these spider-like eldritch beings, faces on the center of their abdomens, caught in swirling tangles of black silk. Human faces. They screamed and howled, creating the false replications of my own calls to my friend, and I was beginning to feel lightheaded and completely overwhelmed when I saw that one of the things closest to me was wearing Tegan's terror-stricken face. I felt my body sway and began to fall backward over the staircase railing, and I must have passed out entirely then. All I know is that I was so high up by then that a fall surely would have left my body a broken heap, completely vulnerable to those demons. But instead, I was woken by a brutish, heavy-set man roughly shaking me and performing chest compressions. I was found in shallow waters off the southern coast of Costa Rica, and some locals saw my unconscious body bobbing in the water and had pulled me to shore. Once I regained consciousness, I had an all-out panic attack, which was made even harder since the Good Samaritans didn't speak much English at all. Emergency personnel eventually made it to the remote location and whisked me away to a nearby hospital where a translator was provided. But not even a translator could explain how an American man who claimed to have set sail from Southern California just the day before had wound up thousands of miles away in the waters of Costa Rica. Anyway, I won't bore you with the details of how I got home, other than to say it was a long and tedious process that never led to any answers. The story was kept pretty hush-hush, even in local papers, which, well, I was thankful for. But Tegan was never found, nor was our boat. I expected the police would be in contact with me, and in fact, I went to them to insist on a full-out manhunt, but they told me they had no idea who I was talking about. There was no record of Tegan ever having existed. I have no pictures of her or us together, and no one in our mutual group of friends knows who I'm talking about. Of course, my family doesn't have any idea either. Medical professionals have chalked it up to my trauma surrounding the incident, but I know better. She was stolen from me, from our world, by whatever it was in that damned house. And I don't know what she saw when we were out there, and I don't know how I escaped, but I know she's still out there. I know, because I see her in my dreams now. They start the same as they did all those months ago, with the storm and the house in front of me. Only now, I can get inside. I get inside and I race up and down the staircase, through the rooms, calling for her over and over. And sometimes I think I see her. But it always winds up being those creatures, crawling all over the walls and sliding around the floors. The one wearing her face always finds me, and she stares at me and screams until I wake up. I've learned how to drive a boat. I've gotten all licenses and permits. I've left a will for my friends and family, and I'm headed out into the water again. I don't care what happens, but if I'm going to find that house again, I'm getting Tegan back.